Good afternoon. We are now ready to begin the part 3. Part 3 is Roundtable, Here and Now, the Movement of Comfort Women. And there are 4 presenters for the afternoon session. And being active in the research and fieldworks, they all took time out of their busy schedules to be here today. First, let me introduce 문경희, Professor of Department of International Relations at Changwon National University. Thank you, Professor. Also joining us today is Lee Kyung-hee, representative of Masan, Changwon, and Jinhae Citizens Group, who are supporting the Japanese military comfort government. Thank you for leaving Changwon at such an early hour to be here today for the conference. Next speaker is from Japan, Toshio Hanafusa, Secretary General of the Kanpu Saiban Support Group for the Post-War Responsibility of Japan and Fukuoka, addressing the comfort women issue, is here with us. Thank you. Also, there's 2 speakers who join us through video. Dorothea Belanova, researcher of East Asian Institute Japanese Studies at Leipzig University, and Xiao Yang Hao, researcher of Faculty of Social and Cultural Studies at Kyushu University. Thank you for your time. Now I will hand over the microphone to Chair, Professor Mungyong-hee. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mungyong-hee, and I am with the Department of International Relations at Changwon National University. It is indeed an honor for me to be able to moderate an important session at an auspicious gathering like this. When it comes to the Japanese Army, the comfort women issue, I have been actively engaged in the research efforts, and I have listened attentively from the morning sessions. I listened to all the presentations by the presenters and discussions by the panels, and I was able to learn a great deal from the presentations and the discussions, and I was greatly inspired to study more on this important topic. And also at the previous session, part 2, we were able to see what artists do, what researchers cannot do with their research work. And I was able to see that they are able to greatly inspire the researchers through their artwork. And in part 3, at the roundtable, I am going to be the moderator. It's a great honor for me. I am very honored to be here as the moderator. We have 4 speakers, as was introduced. The 2 speakers are here in person, and 2 speakers will be joining us online. And officially, I will allocate 15 minutes each for the keynote speakers. But I am willing to allocate a little more time if they want to spend more time. And we'll listen to the 4 keynote speeches, and then we'll open the floor for the discussion. And that is a basic idea of running the roundtable. So you can give us the presenters with questions for the online audience. You are encouraged to do that as well. And I think I'm a timekeeper. I will try to do my job well. So please make sure that you complete your speech within 20 minutes max. So if any of you exceed time, let me send you a memo to remind you that you can't exceed the 20 minutes. And so the first keynote speaker is Lee Kyung-hee, representative of Masan Jinhae Citizens Group for the supporting of the Japanese military comfort women grandmas. And she is from this region where my university is located, and she's very activist in this region. And I feel that I'm very familiar with Lee Kyung-hee because we have the same given name. So please give her a big hand as she begins her keynote speech.
Good afternoon. Just has been introduced. I'm Lee Kyung-hee. Well, my previous script was told to be too long and that I was advised to keep within time. So I tried to summarize what I submitted in the brochure. And I will focus on this summarized version to present. First of all, the struggle of victims. The Comfort Women movement, which began with Kim Il-sung's public testimony and the meeting of the women's movement with the victims, is an unfinished battle, in a word, in which the Comfort Women victims faced the Japanese government. The victims, who were dragged to death and who had no social status, met a strong comrade of the women's rights movement and called Japan's powerful perpetrator into the battleground and put the fight on the ring of international opinion and also gained victory in the international opinion. This normative and public achievement has played an important role in developing and strengthening international norms concerning human rights, especially discrimination and violence against women, while raising international awareness of the myriad of violence against women in the long history of patriarchy. Nevertheless, this fight is not an easy one. The Japanese government, the perpetrator, continues to defy the UN resolutions and recommendations, which are international opinion and normative judgments. It frequently tries to avoid the implementation of recommendations on facts and human rights crime, and is increasingly making conspiracy and trickery to reverse the international public opinion. At the same time, many of the countries that agreed to Japan's recommendation for responsibility, even most Asian countries that were affected by the comfort women issue, are closing their eyes or avoiding the Japanese government's disregard for international resolutions and non-compliance, and in some cases, they actively cooperate with the Japanese government's demands. This situation of the Japanese government and the international community shows that the gap between justice and reality exists, that economic and physical hegemony overwhelms historical justice and human rights norms. Therefore, in reality, the international community's definition of human rights is like a picture frame on the wall. Activists and scholars related to the Japanese military comfort women movement worry that the post-grandma era is not far away. So we share our concerns about how we should prepare ourselves for the post-grandma era and what to prepare before the day comes. This concern about the time when there will be no victims of the Japanese comfort women means that the victims have a very important and symbolic power, which could be comparable to the literature in the movement in solving the Japanese military comfort women issue. This is also because the existence of the surviving victim is precious, no matter what role the victim plays. I used to be asked by many teenagers who were engaged in comfort women activities to allow them or to help them meet and hear from the victims, and also by the media and others to have interviews with the victims when the commemoration date of the comfort women is approaching. Every time that happens, I'm very troubled. Most of the victims I've met and supported for decades are not the known witness in the media or the heroic human rights activists. They are not witnesses. Nevertheless, I believe that they are equally precious individuals. If the victim as a witness and a human rights activist is represented by all victims in Korean society, I think it is far from respecting the human rights of the victims by unilaterally expecting and demanding something from these victims in a stereotyped manner. Each individual victim has a right to testify, just like everybody else in our society. But they also have the right not to speak, and also to speak as much as they want and when they want to speak. However, the comfort women victims that the public remembers and calls for are mainly pure and sad grandmas who became comfort women victims because the state and men could not protect them, or a willed hero grandma who stood up and fought against Japan, the perpetrator. And it is feared that the victims' lives and beyond will be locked in a simple and stereotyped victim's image. Also, this typical comfort woman victim image fails to show that the more fundamental and important issue that patriarchal sexism, oppression, and sexual exploitation are the main background of the comfort women's history, and it may keep the Japanese military comfort woman movement out of the frame of the anti-Japanese movement. In addition, we look back on each victim's feelings about the damage experienced, the way they look at it, and the way they deal with the experience, and whether there are any errors in generalizing some representative adjective expressions or languages. In other words, the victim's experience of damage cannot be representative. But feeling and emotions are free and boundless. But when we look back on whether the experience of many people generalized to the victim's experience and whether the experience of a few people was neglected or missed because it was different from the majority. And what I've heard and saw on site is that many victims are more angry, for example, at their father's violence rather than the pain in the brothel. And some others recall that it was better that they did not starve at the comfort station because they didn't starve as much as they did at home. As we share the experience of the victims, there's the anger against perpetrators, and the hatred or the pain. These are the representative emotions, but there could be different types of emotions, and we have to think whether they could be freely expressed in our society.
As an example, there was the experience.
Sometimes they could meet a very friendly Japanese soldier, or sometimes they made a Japanese soldier as a survival strategy. But these individual experiences are overwhelmed by the sadism of cruel human rights abuses, or on the contrary, irrational claims based on denial of crimes are also due to the generalization centered on representative damage experiences.
And at this point, in this post-grandma era, very frankly speaking, I think the fact that we're using grandma to the victims, I think we should reflect on that, why we use that to describe the victims. But let me skip that part because we don't have that time for that. But I do find the issue of grandma being as a proper noun for the victims. Now, I think it's very important that we think about who the victims are. If you refer to the victim category in the international norms, the victim in a narrow range is a direct victim of sexual slavery in the Japanese military sexual slavery system. More broadly, those who can be said to be secondary victim in the middle range are the family and relatives of the primary victim. And the scope of this direct victim does not include only the survivors who have reported and registered with the government, but they also include victims who are massacred or abandoned on the battlefield, the victims who returned home but died before or after reporting them, and all the silent victims whose number is unknown. Lastly, The victims in a wide range are women with background and essence of the comfort system. They are the women of all ages where exploitation of women's bodies and sexuality occurs, and this includes the wartime sexual violence. They are not only women of the past World War II, but also the women of today who have yet to resolve the brutal history of human rights violations, and they also include women who will live in the future. And at this point, I'm reminded of one of the principles of the feminist counseling here from my experience, supporting women victims of sexual violence and domestic violence. One of the common principles of the feminist counseling theory is that the relationship between the receiving client and the supporting counselor should be equal. If possible, it should be equal, and they should avoid all possible power relations. So there should be equality. That is the most important part. In other words, the client and the counselor they are like colleagues. They're more like comrades in that they are victims of the same patriarchal violence. As such, in the feminist counseling between the client and the counselor, it's not a relationship with someone who receives help and gives help. They are regarded as colleagues. It is a collegial relationship in that they are victims of the same patriarchal violence. And in this, I believe that the Japanese military comfort women victims should include direct and indirect victims, because I believe that is the purpose of this movement is to restore the universal human rights, not only for the direct victims, but for the current and future victims. In this, the concerns we have about not having a direct surviving victims, there will not, the day will come, but the day of having no victims in a broad sense will not come. Now, why do we engage in the comfort women movement? I asked the youth and the young generation this question quite often. If a miracle happens, the Japanese government, because of a thunderbolt lightning, because something that has happened really big, something big has happened in their lives, the Japanese leaders suddenly decide to make a change. There's suddenly a change in their lives, they acknowledge their crimes, and they make an official apology, and they make legal reparations. If they make such a statement, if they suddenly commit to these things, which we have called for, can we say that the purpose of the Comfort Women movement is achieved? This is a question I often ask. And this is about the ultimate purpose of the women, the comfort women, the movement. The ultimate purpose of the comfort women movement is to obtain official apology and receive legal reparations. If it remains there, the fight will only be about a settlement between the victims and the perpetrators in the historical event. Over time, it will be remembered as a history of the past. I believe that the Japanese military comfort women movement should be a part of a fight to resist and end the discrimination, exploitation, and violence against women that predatory, imperialist, militarist, and the capitalist forces committed in collusion with the patriarchal system. Conflicts and wartime sexual violence are rampant worldwide, and violent consumption, exploitations of the female body and sex are occurring right next to us. They will not be ended just by resolving the issue of the Japanese military sexual slavery through negotiations between the direct victims and the perpetrator. It's rampant everywhere, and if we do not change the practices of male-centered sexuality or the structure of desires in the peacetime, then we won't be able to stop the sexual violence against women during the wartime. And we don't need to go too far from here. At this point, we should ask, what are the so-called lessons of the Japanese military comfort women history? And what is the point of remembering this history if we do not relate it to our current problems? This is a question we must be asking ourselves. And in doing so, we should be examining the remarks of the survivors who came forward as human rights activists. I am reminded of late Kim Ak-sun, Kim Bok-dong, and Kim Gil-won-ok, the comfort women victims that passed away. They said that we should not forget the history. And they also said that mothers should do their job properly so that this never happens to the children again. So, if you think about the nature and the characteristics of the Japanese military comfort women movement, and this is to overcome the exploitations against women, the suppressions of the male-centered, the patriarchism. This should not end with legal reparations and official apologies of Japan. That it should not end there. And I think we should look at the sexual exploitation that is happening all the time around us. And the sexual violence is the pain that should never happen again, as the victims have always said in earnest. If you look at the Korean society, remember that there have been major incidents such as the nth room incident and or the doctor's room incident. And how are they different from the sexual slavery exploitation of the Japanese military comfort women system? I believe that the history of the Japanese military comfort women movement, this is really about the sexual violence, the sexual exploitation that is happening right now, right next to us. This is the lesson we should draw from the comfort women issue. This brings it to me to the end of a summary of my long paper, my lengthy paper. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you, Ms. Lee. There was a lot more that she wanted to say, so please read it through at your free time from the booklet. And I was not able to talk about the title. It's from the periphery and the field of comfort women movement. The periphery sounds like a regional locations. Gyeongsang-namdo is the area where the largest number of the comfort women victims reside in. And we are unable to pinpoint to the exact number of the comfort women victims and also keep a record of what has happened to those victims. But there are activists in this region that has provided support to the comfort women victims, and then there are quite a few activists in this region. And Lee Kyung-hee is one of the representatives, activists of the region, and so she has shared her experience with us. I don't need to summarize everything, but I think it's very important that she made this comment. The survivors, the days of having no comfort women survivors will come, but the day of having no sexual violence the victims will not come. And that is why we should continue to engage in a campaign against the sexual violence. This is one point I wanted to highlight from Lee Kyung-hee's comments.
And I'd like to introduce our second speaker. And he has been the Secretary General of the Ganpu Saipan Support Group for the Post-War Responsibility of Japan Fukuoka Networking, addressing the comfort women issue. I'd like to introduce Mr. Toshio Hanafusa. I'd like to ask you to present for about 20 minutes. Please greet him with a big round of applause. I'm from Fukuoka. My name is Toshio Hanafusa.
1990年代に
In the 1990s,
日本でこの元慰安婦の方たちが日本にやってきて
9 cases of Japanese military comfort women lawsuits were filed in Japan, demanding apology and compensation from Japan. The plaintiffs included 2 Koreans, a Korean residing in Japan, a Chinese, and 3 Chinese, a Taiwanese, a Filipino, and also Dutch among the plaintiffs. And there were numerous lawsuits in this district. The lawsuit that I supported was also led by the Busan Division of the Korean Council for the Women drafted for military sexual slavery by Japan, which was led by President Kim Moon-suk. And they included 2 former comfort women and 2 former WVLC members. And well, they included 2 former comfort women and 2 former WVLC members in this lawsuit. And they traveled on the Kampu ferry, so that was why the trial was named Kampu Saipan. And then I continued to working under the Kampu Saipan support group. The Kampu trial was slightly different from other trials. It included 3 former comfort women and also 7 WVLC members. So in total, there were 10 plaintiffs. And the victims of the WVLC plaintiffs were larger in number. In the case of WVLC, it's normally the girls in the elementary school ages, from ages 12 to those that graduated, that were in the middle school, first grade 1 or grade 2, up to 15 years of age. They were mainly very young girls. They were lured by their Japanese homeroom teachers into working in Japan. If you go to Japan to work, you can attend the girls' school and also earn a good wage. And they were lured with these sweet words, and they hopefully wanted to do that and volunteered in many cases. And then these girls who volunteered were taken to the Fujikoshi machinery factory in Toyama that manufactured airplanes or other military equipment and parts. About 1,060 persons were took there, and 300 were transferred to the Mitsubishi airplane factory in Nagoya, and also spinning factory in Shizuoka that manufactured parachutes. About 100 people were mobilized here, and these lawsuits were brought up in Japan. The plaintiffs, just like Mr. Ha or Mr. Park, Ms. Park, the then president of Sangdae, Kim Moon-suk, also attended the trials. In December, I think it was around Christmas in the December of 1992. At the Shimonoseki District Court in Yamaguchi Prefecture, the lawsuit was filed, and then they also visited Fukuoka, and together with the victims, we held a welcoming reception. And I don't know whether you are aware, the plaintiff Park Do-ri, during the party, burst into tears, and we asked her, "Why are you crying?" And the plaintiff Park Do-ri said that, "I thought Japanese were like monsters. in the past, but you're so nice to me. And it is so overwhelming and moving. And that was why she was crying. So we held this welcoming reception and this touched deeply in the hearts of the supporters. And this made us feel that we should really work hard and do more. So we continue to support the trials, 10 people in total. And we had many moving and touching moments.
この私たちは
Back then,
大体10人から15人ぐらいの事務局員と
the Wianbu Saipan support group consisted of about 10 secretariat staff, and there were about 500 members in the support group. And they paid about 3,000 yen in annual membership, and we did fundraising to support the travel expenses of the plaintiffs 4 times a year, and also to cover the cost of publishing the Wianbu Saipan newsletter that was published when the trials took place about 3 or 4 times a year. And we normally published about 100 copies. And this was costly, so we collected and fundraised the membership fee. The plaintiffs would stay at my house or the church guest rooms, and normally they would stay about 2 nights. And after the trial was over, well, back then we used to run a restaurant, so we could have a day off only on Sunday. So in the beginning, on the day of the trial, we didn't work, but the next day we had to work. So we couldn't invite them to my house, but we also had a pastor who also supported us. So we could support them at the church guest rooms. The Wianbu trial, among the trials in Japan, was the only one that ruled in favor. In 1998, the court reached a decision, and the judges ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. And it also was covered very broadly by the Korean media, in Korean media as well. However, unfortunately, the WVLC plaintiffs, compared to the comfort women victims, were judged that their suffering was less severe and their damage was less severe. So this outraged the WVLC plaintiffs. The Yangbun-deok plaintiff in Gwangju, she was very active on the media, and she was very angry and outraged, and she would even lie back on the floor and would cry, "Why did we have to lose?" So I do understand we were happy for the winning of the case of the comfort women, but we were very sad that the WVLC plaintiffs lost the case. In the first case, the court was ruled in favor of the plaintiff, and then in the following Hiroshima High Court trial, Hiroshima is the site of the atomic bombing of US, so there were many civic activist movements. So there were 3 support centers in Hiroshima, and we received the support. So this and the Tokyo trial gained a lot of attention. However, in the Wianbu comfort women trial, the rightist wing felt a high sense of crisis. So the rightist group intervened in the middle school history textbook when the textbook started to carry the historical facts of the comfort women. So they pushed for a movement to publish and distribute a new middle school history textbook. And Then we decided that this should not be distributed in the middle school. So we visited every middle school in Fukuoka and met with the principal and the teachers and persuaded them that this was a very bad textbook, a wrongful record of history, and persuaded them not to select this textbook. But this was not limited to Fukuoka alone, to other parts of the world. But actually, a very 0.00% of the middle schools used this new textbook. And we made a big contribution to come up with this outcome. Also, in the first trial case, this was the ruling. And this was affected by the family members of the former comfort women, Lee Sun-duk and Yang Eun-duk. In the case of Lee Sun-duk, the person received very hard questions during the hearings about the comfort station. She was asked to draw a picture. Well, she drew a picture of the comfort station, and then a very harsh hearing started right after that. It was a comfort station run by Shanghai, and that was when she was sent. It was not run by a private operator. So when she was answering, she fainted, and the doctor had to come to check up on her, and then the proceeding could resume only after she woke up. And it was about a drunken official beating her with the boots and also stabbing her back with a sword, and the scar was still on her body. And then, as she showed these scars on her body, she fainted once again. And then the doctor had to come once again so that she could recover. And these type of incidents took place. And later on, in the audience, and she would also remain as audience even after her hearing and examination was over. I believe that she really wanted to win this case. And I think the judge also was very determined to allow her to win, and it was a very favorable ruling for the plaintiff. And they said that Japan, as a perpetrator of war, should respect the human rights, and it should be stipulated in the Constitution of Japan. And the ruling also said that the Constitution has been upheld. Upholding the human dignity of individual is our constitutional mandate and obligation. So under this constitutional spirit, the Asian victims have been neglected, so we should take responsibility for them. So for at least when the comfort women issue is raised and the Secretary of Ministry Kono should make an apology, and Japan has a responsibility to make the apology and reparation. Nevertheless, up to 1998, even though 5 years has passed, there was no relevant legislative revision, and that this was a full denial of the judiciary system, and that was the contents of this ruling. And this means that it ruled for legislative correction. And this also brought a big shock to the lawmakers of Japan. So some committed lawmakers, after this ruling was announced, made efforts to correct the legislation and to make legal revisions.
もし次に韓国社会においては
Also, in
慰
Korea,
安婦被害者は挺身隊というふうに呼ばれるんですね。それで
there was a tendency of confusing the comfort women and the WVLC members. So 7 members of the WVLC has made testimonies, and this led to the miscommunication and misunderstanding or confusion. There was a WVLC plaintiff speaker, and some people confused her. And in some cases, the husbands would confuse them as comfort women, and then when husbands thought that they were comfort women, they would beat their wives or leave them. And in some cases, the victims of WVLC became so weak and had pneumonia. And so in one case, one of the victims had to marry a man with children. And after she married the man, she bore children. And then the husband refused to put their children in their family record because of her history at the WVLC. And this was another sad testimony that we heard. And in these situations, to be frank, we want to do our best to help them. In this situation, there was a movie called Her Story, and in this movie titled Her Story, there was a story that depicted a WVLC member turn into a comfort woman. So we protested to the director and the producer of the movie after we invited them to Fukuoka. And the director explained that the Comfort Woman's testimony book carried that story. And for example, one of the witnesses testified that about 30 people were sent to a comfort station in Aomori Prefecture after the Fujikoshi factory burned down. In the collection of the testimony, I actually was aware that these testimonies existed. But she was a member of the WVLC. And her family was destroyed and went through a very big hardship. In these cases, the South Korean government started to promise a livelihood support for comfort women victims, referring to them as victims of WVLC. So, many victims of the WVLC came forward. However, the support was only for the comfort women victims. So, the WVLC victims argued that they should be compensated just like the comfort women's, and they would shed tears. And WVLC victims called themselves comfort women and even asked to be registered as comfort women to receive the livelihood support. And I think this is why it was included in the testimony collection. But the Korean people of today just referred to this collection and confused the comfort women with the WVLC. In my case, in Japan, the WVLC back then were sent to factories, and they were mainly young school students. And in Japan, it was widely known in the public, and this was different from the comfort women issue. That was the general perception in Japan. But in Korea, I don't know whether it was last year or the year before, when there was the two rulings on the comfort women issue, when you look at the historical perception of the comfort women, the normal story is that they were lured by their school teacher, and they thought they were being mobilized as WVLC, but they were forced to become comfort women. But as a matter of fact, I think Chung Dae-hyuk, the Korean Council, we understand that the reference was made by the recording of Chung Dae-hyuk. Ms. Yoon Jong-ok was the first founding president of Chung Dae-hyuk, and she came to Japan to testify for the Kwanbu trial. She was listening to the victims' testimonies. So President Yoon Jong-ok was aware that comfort women and WVLC were different. And so we requested her to clarify this when she goes back to Korea. And we asked that Chung Dae-hyuk changes its name from the name that is only for the comfort women. So that it was changed, so that the name is changed. But this was not reflected. And at the Nagoya trial for the Mitsubishi case, back then the president of Chung Dae-hyuk was Hyun Mi-yang, and we also requested that the name was changed. When we say 정신대, which is the WVLC, we requested that this was clarified in Korea, but we believe that this was neglected and ignored. And even in court rulings, just as today, the mistaken historical perception is still valid. And the problem is that the rightist wing of Japan tries to manipulate this. In Korea, there is a deception that something happened even though it did not happen, and that it is blaming Korea. And that is being used by the rightist of Japan to create an anti-Korean sentiment in Japan. And this is stimulating the situation in Japan. And on the other hand, in the case of Korea, there is another protest. So in the long run, in Japan, the comfort women issue will continue to create a vicious cycle. It will never be solved. And how long do we have to carry on with this? And regarding the comfort women issue, we see more and more people giving up. So what I want to say is, Japan and Korean researchers and the civil activists should create a common perception of history based on a common research. Through the common research, the testimonies of witnesses and the victims and historical verification should be all thoroughly managed so that Korea and Japan creates a common understanding of history. And it should be communicated to the general media as well as the educational sector of the two countries. And by making this initiative, I think, and creating this common solution, this will contribute to helping the victims of the past war. Also, when we really wanted to put this into action, we faced with the COVID-19 situation. There's Dr. Tono Maura in Japan and very long-standing researchers in this area, and we have been conducting various seminars and meetings. So when the COVID-19 situation is over, we believe that these researchers and us will continue with this initiative. I apologize for taking too long. It was a very important topic, so I apologize so that I had to interrupt you. If you have some things to add and if you have any follow-up questions, I'd like to ask you to add on to your presentation in the following roundtable. And the key issue is that, well, I read the book on Kwanbu trial for about 6 years. I think we attended the trial for about 23 times, and sometimes a person would attend for about 20 times. And you say you are one of the supporters that have been through the process throughout all the trials. And you said that WVLC plaintiffs were not recognized for their damage because it was less severe than comfort women. That was very regrettable. And in Korea, they suffer a secondary damage because they're confused as comfort women in Korea. And you said that that is still confusing in Korea, and this triggers and this kind of stimulates anti-Korean sentiment in Japan. And this type of situation should be resolved by a common research by the two countries with the same goal. Thank you for your presentation, and move on to the third presentation.
And the third presenter joins us through Zoom connection. She is Dorothea Miladenova, researcher of East Asian Research Institute at the Japanese Studies of the Leipzig University. She's going to talk about localization, the Statue of Peace, and the comfort women issue in Germany. Please speak for about 15 minutes. The mic is yours.
Hello, good morning from Germany. I hope you can hear me. Do you see my presentation?
Yes, we do.
Okay,
go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Good. So I would like to speak about the Statue of a Girl for Peace by sculptors Kim Seok-young and Kim Un-sung, and how it was received in Germany, especially in Berlin. So please go on to the next slide. I would like to talk about the memory culture in Germany. And this, because this is the setting where we see the Statue of a Girl for Peace. Then I want to just briefly talk about the different statues that have been installed in Germany. Then I will talk about the nationalist reading of the statue. And in the end, I want to present the localization of the statue in Germany. So move on to the next slide, please. Germany is internationally known for its coming to terms with its World War II atrocities, and the German memory culture concerning the Holocaust is often referred to as a model for dealing with similar instances of violence or other instances of violence. The history of war atrocities committed by Germans in World War II is extensively taught in schools, and it is memorialized in the public sphere. However, Germany's memory culture has been criticized for some shortcomings, of which I want to present three. First, in stark contrast to the thorough treatment of the history of National Socialism, the history of colonialism, on the other hand, has been neglected until recently. So, for example, only now have ethnographic museums, such as the one in Leipzig, which you can see on the slide, started to return looted artifacts from their collections. So Germany has a long history of colonialism, and only in the last 10, 15 years, we can see it more in the public discussion. Second, the topic of sexual violence during the war is hardly dealt with in schools, if at all, and it is hardly found in public space outside of expert circles. So during World War II, the German armed forces had created military brothels for their soldiers in Eastern Europe, but also in Western Europe. And even there were brothels for inmates of concentration camps. So for those who were to be rewarded for their forced labor. And third, German history continues to be taught and thought of predominantly in a national container. And this ignores the increasing number of migrants who are now 25% of the population, and they all bring their own histories and are demanding that those histories are included in public memory. Therefore, German memory culture is currently undergoing a post-colonial shift, a post-migrant shift, so including those migrant perspectives, and an intersectional shift. This means that now there is more emphasis on questions of gender, race, and ethnicity. And this is the context in which the Statue of Peace was erected in Berlin. And these are the discourses in which the activists participate. So next slide, please. This is a small history of the different statues of peace in Germany. There was the Berlin statue, which was erected in the year 2020. But before that, there was one failed attempt in Freiburg in the south of Germany. It failed because of the intervention of the Japanese consulate and also the sister city of Freiburg in Japan. After that, two statues were installed, one near Regensburg, which is in Bavaria in the south of Germany, and one in Frankfurt. And both of them were on private ground. So the Berlin statue was a real game changer because it was the first one to be erected on public ground. And then after the Berlin statue, next slide, please. There were two more bronze statues which appeared in Germany. So one was in Dresden, that's in the east of Germany. It's just 1 hour east from here where I live. And it was part of an exhibition. And then there was another one which was unveiled only this year in the city of Kassel. And this is on the ground of university, so that's a semi-public space. It's a bit complicated there. So it's a public space, but it's autonomously governed. So the Berlin statue was the first one on public ground. And because it was to be erected on public ground, the bureaucracy had to be involved, and there had to be a formal application to the local government. And on the next slide, please. On the next slide, I just want to show you the different levels of government because it's important to understand the statue. So Berlin is not only the capital of the Federal Republic of Germany, but it is also a city-state. So on the city level, we have the Senate, but neither the federal government nor the Senate are responsible for the Statue of Peace. It is on the local level, on the district level. So Berlin has 12 districts, and one of them is the Mitte district. That's why I will speak about Berlin Mitte. And this is where the application to erect the statue was filed. And this is already the first localization moment because it's in a very, they only discuss with the local government. So the installers in Berlin, when they applied for it, I have seen the application. They framed the statue as a universal symbol of sexual violence in wartime and for the rights of women. And they pointed out the relevance of the statue for Berlin by referring to sexualized violence in Germany. So I think it's a point that Lee Kyung-hee just also made in her keynote, that the relevance for here and now is really pointed out. So if you show the next slide, you will see a quote. Yes, a quote from an excerpt from the application. So it says, in Germany too, sexualized violence is a repressed and taboo subject. 1 in 7 women in Germany experiences punishable acts of sexualized violence on 1 or more occasions. And then the applicants pointed out that the silencing of the victims, of the comfort women victims, is part of a structural problem of sexual violence. And they underscored the legacy of the South Korean and Asian comfort women movement as having broken this silence. And this makes them a global role model that we in Germany can learn from. So this universalist approach was also displayed in the unveiling ceremony. The speakers at the unveiling, for example, just to name one, included the former director of the Ravensbrück Memorial Museum. So this memorial museum was built at the site of a former Nazi women's concentration camp. And this concentration camp supplied 220 sex slaves to 10 Nazi concentration camp brothels during World War II. So thus, the Statue of Peace was set within this context of sexual violence in wartime, irrespective of nationalities, but as a structural, as a gender problem. On the next slide, please. So after the opening of the statue, the Japanese Foreign Ministry asked for its removal. And so the district office in Berlin-Mitte, in fact, listening to them, withdrew its approval of the application. This caused a large-scale protest campaign on the side of the installers and their supporters. And this also turned the Statue of Peace in Berlin into a place of the Sonyo-san phenomenon. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, the girl statue phenomenon, which is described by Vicky Kwan as voluntary citizen activism involving protecting the statue from being removed and installing replicas and variations of the statue in South Korea and abroad. Finally, after these protests, the statue was allowed to remain, and it has been standing there now for more than 2 years, but it is still under debate and disputes whether it can remain. So on the next slide, I want to just talk a little bit more about the installers. Who are they? Are they Koreans, and why does it matter? I have noticed a tendency in Japanese newspapers to only simplify them and simply call them a group of Koreans, Kankoku Jin Dantai, or a group of citizens with Korean origin, Kankoku-kei Shimin Dantai. And this, I think, is just reducing them to their nationality or ethnicity, which for one is not true. Not all of them do have origins in Korea, and also many of them have lived in Germany for many, many years. So it would be too oversimplified to understand them as just Koreans and nothing else, nothing beyond that. And also, in my opinion, just reducing them to their ethnic origin also indirectly is trying to imply some political opinion of anti-Japanism. And this is definitely not the case. The members of the group, first of all, renounce nationalism. They see nationalism as part of the problem. It's part of the structures that enable sexual violence against women in the first place. I also want to stress that the people here are people from civil society, and they are not affiliated with the state. And I am stressing this because even the district office of Berlin-Mitte, in their letter in which they revoked the approval to erect the statue, they said that the statue represented a specific commentary on Japanese policy from the Korean side. And I am wondering, what do they mean with the Korean side? It sounds as if, is it the Korean state that they mean? No, obviously they mean Korea Association, the organization that applied for the installation of the statue. And I think this is just a way too simple description of what is happening here. So I want to show that there are at least 3 different entities that are responsible for the erection of the Statue of Peace in Berlin. One is Korea Association. It's a civil society organization that has the legal status to formally submit an application with the district office. And then second, we have a very loose group, the working group Comfort Women, which it is an informal group without fixed membership. Its meetings are organized by Korea Association, but otherwise the members do not overlap. So anyone in Berlin or in Germany who is interested in the topic of comfort women can come to those meetings of the working group. And in fact, many people just join for the organization of one event. They attend 2 or 3 sessions, and then they just don't come anymore. It's in flux. It's a moving group. So there is no way to say who are the members of this group because it's always changing. And there are people who have been there for 20 or 30 years, but also many who just come and go. And also, I have already mentioned, they have very different backgrounds of nationality, ethnicity, and so on. But so they come together based on their common political interest in justice for comfort women, women's rights, and sexual violence. So their unifying factor is feminism and not nationality. And then those 2 groups are supported by the Alliance. You can see on the right side a list of 30 civil society organizations, initiatives who have dedicated themselves to the fight against sexual violence in general or in certain other countries. So you see Women of Sudan Uprising, the Afghan Women's Cafe, etc. So many different backgrounds. And these groups, and then there's also groups representing Asian communities, both of Korean and non-Korean origin. And this is what Daniel Schumacher calls an inter-ethnic atrocity alliance that they have formed. So the alliance works in a way that they support each other and join each other's events and protest rallies. Yes, so this mutual support is one more important factor in universalizing the statue, but also for localizing it. And this is where I come to my main point, the localization of the statue. So the statue is not only framed within a universalist context of human and women's rights, but it is also carefully intertwined with the local level. For example, if you look at the placement of the statue, it is found in a quiet residential area, and it is not across from the Japanese embassy, for example, or other symbols of nation states. So the target group is the local population, and you can see the locals are interacting with it. For example, there is a flower shop which is next to the statue. They regularly donate flowers. Then someone has donated flower pots, and then there are people who are not members of Korea Association or the working group Comfort Women, but who just come in the morning on their way to work and they just water the plants just because they somehow have some feelings towards the statue. I have seen children playing around it. So I think the citizens are already integrating it into their everyday life in their local area. But also the statue is actively used by Korea Association for educational activities. They also have a museum for comfort women where they don't only show the history of comfort women, but also of sexual instances of sexual violence in the past in different geographic areas. And they talk about this, but also about sexual violence in the present. Yeah, and on the next slide, I want to show how the statue is also used by other organizations which have nothing to do or indirectly or only indirectly connected. So I would say that the interactions by local citizens and groups also bring about unexpected new meanings. So for example, in November 2020, just 2-3 months after the statue was erected, the organization Grannies Against the Extreme Right started holding vigils at the statue, which they see as a symbol for a cosmopolitan, anti-racist Berlin. The Grannies are a citizen group of mainly retired women who protest the recent resurgence of racism and extreme right-wing positions in Austria and Germany. On 19 February 2021, they dedicated a vigil at the statue to the victims of the Hanau shootings in 2020. So the Hanau mass shooting was an incident where a far-right extremist who was motivated by a racist ideology massacred 9 people before he killed his mother and himself. So here we see none of the victims of this shooting had a background in East Asia, but the statue is one of the few monuments in the Berlin public space, if not maybe the only one, that depicts a person of color. So it has been repurposed here as an overall monument to racism and racist violence. And on the next slide, I want to show one more example. Next slide, please.
Excuse me, 2 minutes left.
Yes, okay. So I just wanted to show that there was also a vigil held by Asian people of color, and it was to mourn those killed in the Atlanta mass shooting in March 2021, which happened in the United States. So again, something which didn't happen in Germany, but they see a direct relation to the structures of racism in Germany as well. And now I want to show what we have done in Leipzig with it. So we were observing these developments in Berlin, and we were asking, so how can we further localize the statues? How can we ask, how is it relevant for Leipzig? And we started an experiment where we did lectures, classes, study visits, and performances. And next slide, please. On the next slide, you will see some images. So we borrowed a mobile Statue of Peace, a plastic replica, and we took it to different places. We took it to the lecture hall. We did a class on the history of comfort women and sexual violence. We invited people who were talking about the World War in Germany and also the Ukrainian case. So one common topic that we found was we were trying to find a link between the comfort women history and our local history, Leipzig history. And one common topic that we found was that of forced labor. So if we consider the comfort women as forced sexual laborers, then the issue of forced labor can become such a link. So during World War II, Germany had 13 million people who they forced to work in the factories, and including political prisoners, but also people from Eastern Europe. And in Leipzig alone, 75,000 forced laborers were there. So in the pictures, you can see how we took the statue to a former cotton mill factory, which also had 500 forced laborers, and nowadays serves as an art hub. It's an international art hub with internationally renowned artists. So this was actually a gallery meeting, and it had nothing to do with the history. But then in the second picture, you can see that we went on a study visit at the Leipzig Nazi Forced Labor Memorial Museum. And then on the third picture, you can see a student performance, a sound performance, which they prepared in the class, which is an immersive experience to just make people think about the comfort women history. And just to conclude, so I just want to say that for us, our takeaway was that the statue is an interesting tool for carrying the comfort women history around and informing people about it, but also to ask what is the connection with local history and how is it relevant? How is this history a global history? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. We have seen a lot of news coverage about the Berlin experience. We were very interested to see the developments in Germany, in Berlin, and we had a great deal to learn from the presenter. Thank you very much. And we are very curious about it, what's happened in Germany. And I think German experience is distinguishable from other overseas cases because it's been highly localized. And we see a lot of visitations by the local people there, and this has been related to global issues about going against racism and other forms of the sexual violence. And I think in this is a very intriguing case, and this is yet to be further developed in other international cases. And if there are more opportunities in the future, I really hope to hear more about it. Is this about the spatial thing, or is it because of the strategy that the installers has taken? And the last presenter to be introduced is Xiao Yang Hao of the Kyushu University. He's a researcher, faculty of social and cultural studies. She's going to talk about transmitting knowledge and gaining recognition, Chinese comfort women reparation trials in the 1990s and 2000s.
5분 정도 남으면 제가 한번 그 말씀.
I'd like to ask you to speak about 15 minutes, and I'll inform you when you have 2 minutes left.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, organizers, for all the efforts you put into organizing this conference. And I feel my presentation actually has a lot in common with Hanafsa-san's ones, because he was directly involved in the reparation litigations. But in my case, when those legal proceedings was still going on, I was a primary school student, so I wasn't involved anyway. But I examined the court records of some of the legal proceedings, and I've learned a great deal from them. So today I'll be presenting part of my research findings. So, okay. The issue of reparations for wartime Japanese atrocities was first brought to the attention of a group visiting Japanese lawyers by a Chinese journalist in 1994. And having been made aware of the issue, those lawyers had a meeting upon returning to Japan and decided to represent victims pro bono. And also they secured support from civil groups. And with the assistance of Japanese lawyers, scholars, and feminists, surviving comfort women from Shanxi and Hainan provinces filed for collective lawsuits demanding a formal apology and state reparations. And I will be referring to these four lawsuits as a first case, the second case, a Shanxi case, and Hainan case. Sorry, because I thought we had, I thought I had 20 minutes, so I'll have to skip around. So basically, I will be focusing specifically on the court proceedings, and I'll share with you the research findings I have by examining the court records and also the lawyers' own memoirs. And I argue that the victims and their lawyers managed to turn the courtroom into a site for knowledge transmission and legal recognition. The court hearings thus set a kind of precedent for civil litigations elsewhere involving historical injustices against the woman. Moreover, the proceedings also carry implications for activists, scholars, and judicial personnel considering how to approach cases involving sexual violence in the courtroom while restoring respect and agency to victims. The court transcripts show that the lawyers caused the victims' voices to be heard, either by calling them to testify before the court or by presenting their testimonies in the form of videotapes or signed statements. In this case, the reparation trials granted victims a chance to develop their own narratives in the public legal forum. And the lawyers acting on behalf of the Japanese state usually is very interesting. They usually summarize their jurisprudential opinion in the legal briefs without really voicing their views regarding the credibility and reliability of testimonies delivered by victims before the court. And this actually meant that victims' narratives were not truncated, nor was the truthfulness of their testimonies challenged over inconsistencies and lapses in memory. And my examination of these testimonies draws on performance scholar Elizabeth Song's analysis of the 2000 Women's Tribunal and literary scholar Shoshana Feldman's analysis of the legal proceedings of the Eichmann trial in 1961. So Song argues that the Women's Tribunal in 2000 functioned as a site of knowledge production and community formation. And she also points out that the proceedings of the Women's Tribunal ushered in a process-oriented conception of justice. And Feldman points out that the victims' testimonies brought historical events into the courtroom of the Eichmann trial in 1961. And similarly, by calling victims to testify before the court hearings of the Comfort Women trials also functioned to transmit historical events into the present through the medium of narratives and the presence of witnesses. And my examination of the testimonies is based on this idea of transmission. Although 4 cases put Chinese witnesses on witness extent, the section for this presentation, I'll be focusing specifically on the Shanxi case, well, due to the availability of court transcripts. And in the Shanxi case, the longest testimony was delivered by Wang Aihua, who was forced into sexual slavery 3 separate times between 1942 and 1943. The questions and answers exhibited in the court transcripts demonstrate the lawyer's attempt to have the intersectionality of victims' suffering recognized by the court. So intersectionality is a term coined by feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. It means that gender discrimination, racial injustice, and class exploitation, well, among other forms of contextual and structural inequalities, they all intertwine to cause women's oppression. So although the lawyers didn't reference the term directly in their legal briefs, the way they solicited testimonies illustrates their desire to add nuance to the judicial understanding of the suffering of comfort women. For example, in response to lawyers' questions, Wang Aihua revealed that her experience of being sold as a child bride, and later in her testimony, after revealing her first escape from the cave, where she was kept in captivity for interrogation and sexual abuse. This Chinese victim mentioned that she was no longer welcomed back by the family into which she was sold as a child bride. And so the narrative that unfolds in one story, that victim's story, points to the multivalence of her lifelong hardship and sexual abuse. A different victim of the comfort woman system testified that she had also been abused, not sexually though, by a Chinese collaborator. And so through these testimonies, Chinese complicity in the operation of comfort woman system also came to light. So in this sense, various factors intersected in subjecting comfort women to military sexual violence and social prejudice. By unveiling the manifold acts of violence and discrimination against victims, lawyers sought to facilitate a comprehensive judicial understanding of victims' physical and psychological pain. In addition to former comfort women themselves, the lawyers also called on daughters or foster daughters of victims to give testimony on behalf of their deceased mothers. A daughter of a former comfort woman was called to bear witness to her mom's PTSD resulting from sexual enslavement. And noteworthy is that this daughter described scenes in which her mother, the former comfort woman, beat her up for no reason and regretted her violent behavior after regaining her composure. And engulfed by this threat of violence during childhood, the daughter herself had developed various psychological conditions as a result and relied on sedative drugs and painkillers for headaches. So this story showcases the intergenerational suffering brought about by the comfort woman system. And trauma here became contagious as it transmitted to immediate family members, exposing them to violence from the traumatized original victims. And in this sense, for victims and their families, victimization is a process, to borrow Kathleen Daly's words, and the trauma ruthlessly defies both victims' humanity and their familial bonds over time. Aside from descriptions of multi-layered violence, the representation of sex crimes also deserves attention. So when asking questions related to sex crimes, instead of using explicit words such as rape or sexual slavery, Kawaguchi employed the phrase victimization of women. So unlike prosecutors in criminal trials who tend to insist on soliciting a description of vaginal penetration, this episode, in this sense, clearly reflects the lawyer's understanding of many women's desire to circumvent detailed descriptions of sex crimes and even the term rape itself. And it also shows the lawyer's intention to restore to comfort women victims a sense of control and authority over their own narratives. And besides verbal expressions, one also sought to express pain and trauma through her physical exhibitions. So she demonstrated to the court through physical postures how exactly she was abused. By reenacting the scene of torture and by calling attention to her own injured body, the victim used her altered physical frame as evidence of the violence inflicted upon her and enabled the audience to experience her physical pain vicariously. So this exhibition constitutes what Shoshana Feldman calls the physical legal dimension of the court, in which the injured bodies before the court carried jurisprudential speaking power. And they thus transmitted the experience of pain to the court through their physical exhibition and presence. The victim's burning desire to represent herself was also manifested in a number of verbal outbursts. On several occasions, this same victim, Wang Hua, she disrupted court proceedings and demanded an apology and fair judgment. At times, after answering the questions asked by Kawaguchi, one turned to address the judges directly, expressing her fervent desire for justice. And her verbal reiterations and disruptions cogently transmitted to the court the victim's motivation to bear witness. And during the court proceedings, although the lawyers always directed the testimony back to the questions, neither the lawyers nor judges disrupted the victims' narratives or dismissed it as irrelevant. So in this sense, the lawyers turned the courtroom into a relatively safe space where victims transmitted their knowledge and experience to the court while attempting to exert control over their stories. And through the process of delivering testimony, lawyers and victims together transcended the meaning of the courtroom and carved out a space in which victims could attempt to explain to the court the intersectionality of suffering and intergenerational pain brought about by the comfort woman system. As a group of victims who are always denied their voices in history and their agency in memory, what they demanded first and foremost was recognition. So now I'm going to turn to recognition. And so all the comfort woman reparation trials involving Chinese witnesses, Chinese victims, stress the importance of course recognition of both historical facts and victims' suffering. The lawyers representing victims pointed out that one of the most important reasons why victims decided to initiate lawsuits was their desire for the court to validate their claims to victimhood. So how did the lawyers strive to achieve this goal of recognition? So to begin with, they attempted to arouse the empathy of the judges by appealing to their humanity and by connecting the wartime sexual slavery system to contemporary sex crimes. So during one court case, for example, the lawyers associated legal recognition of historical facts and suffering related to the comfort woman system with the judges' sensitivity as human beings. To further stimulate the judges' empathy, the lawyers asked the judges to imagine how they might feel should such sexual violence be perpetrated against our own daughters. The lawyer's intention to induce empathy in the judges is evident from the account in lawyer Omori Noriko's memoir. So Omori reveals that the lawyers deemed it their duty to soften the heart of the judges and to stimulate their imaginations. With the written documents alone, they assumed it might be difficult for judges to understand properly the agony that victims endured, since the plaintiffs were non-Japanese and the crimes took place decades ago. So both the testimonies and the legal briefs were designed to arouse empathetic feelings among the judicial personnel to gain legal recognition of what the comfort woman victims endured. Although the comfort women lost their lawsuits, together with the lawyers, they carved out an official legal discursive space for a comprehensive representation of their suffering. The court verdicts on all cases involving Chinese comfort women, except for one, recognized as facts the sex crimes and torture inflicted upon victims, as well as their subsequent lifelong physical and psychological suffering, including PTSD. Although the courts ultimately denied victims' requests for an apology and reparations, this recognition itself held considerable significance. As two other scholars have pointed out, victim survivors of sexual violence consider recognition itself as justice. And official acknowledgement also sends out a message to victim survivors and society as a whole that rather than shameful women to be disdained, comfort women are wronged victims who deserve respect and recognition at the very least. Therefore, for a better understanding of civil trials involving sexual violence and historical injustice, it's essential to go beyond an examination of the final verdicts. And proceedings of the reparation trials also carry implications for other civil litigations, elsewhere adjudicating sexual violence in a world fraught with sexual and gender-based historical injustice and ongoing sexual violence in armed conflict. They exemplify a defiance of persistent taboos surrounding the verbal articulation and physical representation of sexual violence that hold lessons for future responses to such atrocities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since you were the last in order, I did not want to stop you and interrupt, and nevertheless you kept within the time. Well, I'm not that familiar with that, but as I listened to the 20-minute presentation, I became aware of about the trials of the Chinese comfort women victims in Japan, and how they could tell their story in court and how they could gain the recognition in the space of the courtroom. Of course, they did lose the trial, but they could persuade the judges of their victimization. And as we listen to the Gwanbu case, I think there is much that we could compare all together. Thank you for the very informative presentation. We were slightly late in our schedule. We're officially to end at 5:30. Will the organizer allow us about 10 or 20 more minutes for discussion? If we are allowed additional time, we have 4 presentations, and we have our audience, and we also have our participants from the Zoom. I'd like to ask you to first introduce yourself and make a brief question, and also to point out who you're asking a question to. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a question. You could make a comment about the presentations you've listened to. So now we'll open the floor for question and comments. Are there any questions collected on our YouTube channel? If we have any channels, I'd like to appreciate it if they're delivered to us. I think some of the audience want to raise their hands to ask questions. We will receive questions.
네, 지금 손이 번쩍 올라왔습니다.
I see a hand being raised. Please have the microphone delivered.
안녕하세요.
Good afternoon.
대전대 글로벌 지역 문화연
I am a researcher at Daejeon University. My name is Lee Ji-young, and my area of specialty is global cultural studies. I have listened attentively to the 4 keynote presentations. It's been a great learning experience for me, and I feel that it's a very rewarding experience. I find that it's very fortunate that I was able to attend today's conference.
깊은 감사를 드립니다.
And I thank each and every one of you
네 분의 발표를 들으면서
and for your excellent presentations. Having listened to the presentations, the keywords I extracted from all the presentations would be local and empathy
전이라고
and dissemination and the transfer of pain.
키워드를 놓고
So having extracted these keywords, I'd like to now pose questions to the presenters. To Ms. Lee Kyung-hee, the first speaker, you work in a local environment. You provide support to the victims, and you're engaged in a campaign to overcome this the comfort women issue. And in retrospect, as a regional, as a local activist,
다른 방식의 그 운동이 아닌 지역에서
what was it like to engage in a local campaign? What was the kind of outcome you were able to achieve because you were based in a locality instead of being at the capital city in Seoul?
조금 아쉬워.
And also, in retrospect, what are some of the shortcomings you feel you wanted to overcome but couldn't? That's my question for the first speaker. And the second question I have is for Ms. Dorothea Mildenova.
이 평화의 소녀상이
You talked about the Statue of Peace, localization of a Statue of Peace. And you gave us some success factors. Please give us some success factors of why localization of this peace statue was possible. Solidarity was about the liberating efforts to liberate women from sexual violence. But there could also be the solidarity formed between the rightist factions as well. When the rightist group form an alliance, they tend to try to divide the people, their counterparts. They want to divide. In other words, the Holocaust experience and the comfort woman experience could be put in a competition so that people can be divided within the group. I think this is a part of strategy that the rightist faction use, attempting to divide and rule. So I'd like to know if there have been such attempts by the rightist party and that there's been efforts to overcome if there have been such challenges coming from the rightist faction as well. Yes, while the presenters think about their responses, why don't we invite the question more from the floor? Or if possible, using the moderator's opportunity, I'd like to pose the questions to the other presenters.
Well, why was it Shimonoseki? It was something that I wasn't aware. Why was it necessarily Shimonoseki, not Fukuoka and any other district? And what was its relationship with the Comfort Women trial and the Comfort Women movement? What kind of historical meaning does it have in that the trial was in Shimonoseki? How could we understand that? That is my question to Mr. Hanasu Fusa and to Ms. Hao Xiaoyang. You talked about intersectionality, and you said that Chinese people also conspired to running the comfort station. Well, this trial took place in Japan, and in China. I want to know how this trial was viewed, and what was the Chinese perception and understanding of the Chinese victims of comfort women? What kind of solidarity was created? So this is my question toward all of you. So I'd like to ask the four speakers to reply in order. Ms. Lee Kyung-hee, please.
제가 질문 들었습니다. 지역이기 때문에
You were based in a locality, and what was it more possible because you were based in a locality compared to the activists in the center, in the capital city? So having been engaged in the various movements in a local region, what do you think was more special that made you succeed in certain campaigns? I'm not sure if I understood you correctly, but I think we can learn from the German experience. In Changwon, we don't use the girl's statue, the name. We don't use the name, the girl statue. We receive complaints a lot because people believe that we should be using the girl statue name. But if you look at the structure, it's not the same as the installations that you have in front of the Japanese embassy. This is actually a structure that has been directed by the citizens of Changwon, from children to very old people. They all came together for this monument. And this monument is a standing figure of a girl in a bare feet. And Professor Moon was a part of our discussions for erection of this monument. And while we were discussing it, we thought about how to commemorate the comfort women and how the comfort women should come in contact with the citizens of Changwon. We did not want it to be a divine character. We did not want to look up to their character. We want to have something that we could relate to more, and we could embrace the shoulder to shoulder, something that is familiar and with the same height as ours. So we wanted a familiar figure that should be erected, installed in the Changwon city, and we felt that it was a more easier way for people to relate to the comfort women. And also the name of the structure is quite wrong. And the sculpture is called the Monument for Our Commitment to Human Rights, Independence and Peace. That is the full name. So we felt that human rights must be included in the name. And another group said that because this is something that has happened during the time of aggression of the Japanese, so independence is a very important keyword. There was another group that said that this is a wartime sexual violence, and therefore the keyword peace is really important. So the three concepts were actively discussed, so we decided to include them all. And also we said that this is a monument that bears our commitment. If you look at the structure sculpture, this is not just something that you could take a commemorative photo of to look at, but we thought that this is a monument where people should be able to relate. And people should be the subjective characters in forming this relationship with the monument. We felt that they should be the subjects instead of being placed as the other. That's what we wanted to say by saying this is a monument to commit to the human rights, independence, and peace. So we wanted to bring in all the pledges of the citizens in erecting this sculpture. So there was a lot of internal discussions, and I have to say that it was a very lengthy process. We had a lot of differing opinions, but I think that's what movement is all about. We discussed with the citizens. We continue our discussions. We engage the citizens in coming up with a solution, a decision. And in the pursuit process, we hold roundtables, we do surveys, and we did a lot of things. And also, I believe that the sculpture is quite special because of where it was erected. So I think we're quite similar to the German experience. We didn't want to set up in somewhere where there are other structures of nation states. We wanted to set up this sculpture in a square where there's a lot of people passing by. And it's an entertainment area as well. There are a lot of karaoke singing rooms, and there are a lot of restaurants and the bars. So there's been a lot of complaints coming from the owners of these entertainment shops. But the committee members made a lot of efforts to overcome all these complaints. Still, the owners of the bars and restaurants and singing rooms, they say that we should be relocating the monument. They lobbied to the local government to have this sculpture moved to somewhere else. And this is the girl statue erected in the Ojongdong, which is the name of the district. And some people lobby to have it removed. And I tell them this is a collective decision of the citizens. I'm not in a position to make the decision myself to relocate. That's my official response. And I think the Comfort Women movement has been carried out with active participation of the citizens of the Machangjeong region, and people share the experience of the history of the human rights related to Comfort Women. I think from the activist group, this is a very important point. I hope that I answered your question. Thank you very much. For your reference, there are many cities in the Gyeongnam province, and many activists of the Gyeongnam province erected the sculptures on their own, and they all look very different. They always say that the Gyeongsang, the activists, are women of character. So I think it's going to be quite meaningful if you toured around the Gyeongnam region to see how different the sculptures were. And now I'd like to ask Ms. Dorothea to respond to the question posed to you.
Yes, thank you. I hope I understood your question correctly. I wish I could be there with you and then we could discuss it during a coffee break, but I will try to address your question. So you said that, if I understood you correctly, that what is the success recipe of this or the strategy of this sculpture in Berlin, because solidarity can also be there between rightists who divide and rule. And you were also referring to the Holocaust experience and the Comfort Women experience being put into competition. This just reminded me a little bit of the competition that we can also see between Holocaust memory in Germany and colonialism, the colonial memory. And I think we can learn from this, because currently there is this debate in historical sciences of multi-directional memory. So how can we not put them in competition, but just remember both things and also see how they are related, and how maybe colonialism in Germany also paved the way for National Socialism and the Holocaust. So I think that the same can be said about, we cannot compare the Holocaust and the Comfort Women experience, of course, but I think that we can remember both, and we have to talk about both. So one unifying factor of the localization of the Comfort Women issue in Germany is the topic of colonialization. And it meets simply, I didn't talk much about it, but there is a big debate in Berlin about the colonial past of Germany. And I think South Korean history, memory culture is way more advanced in terms of discussing its colonial history. And Germany has basically just started. So, and I think one more success would be acknowledging the complexity. I think what the rightists do is that they give very simple answers to complex questions. And I think the comfort women experience and the experience of sexual violence is more complex than that. As Lee Kyung-hee said in her keynote, we should not have one stereotype of comfort women, but there are different voices, and it is way more complex than just the narrative that maybe everyone wants to hear. So I think the important point to localize it is just to acknowledge the complexity of the problem. Yeah, and my last point is in Berlin, I think the rightists, at least the Berlin in the district assembly, they have no big voice because the assembly is Social Democrats and Left and Green Party. And then the rightists are in the opposition, and there's the Liberal Party in the opposition. And actually it was the Liberal Party who said that this monument, this Statue of Peace, does not serve as a universal symbol against sexual violence, and that and they demanded for a more universal sculpture, which I found a bit problematic, because this somehow also means that a sculpture which looks Asian is not universal. So what does it mean? Does it mean that only a sculpture that depicts a Caucasian person or a white person is universal, or should it be an abstract sculpture? So I think this just touches exactly the problem of the structural racism, this argument. And it's not just there in the right, but it's also there in the liberal, economic liberal party. Yeah.
네, 답변 감사합니다.
Well, thank you very much. Having listened to your response, I'm more intrigued to know more about German experience. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to get in touch with you, engage more for more discussions about the discussions on the colonialism in Germany. And that was very interesting. And about the politicians speaking up, voicing up their opinions. I think this is going to open another arena for the discussions on the comfort women issue. And now I'd like to ask Mr. Hanafusa and the Hao Xiaoyang to respond.
제가 지금 무슨 질문했는지 여쭤보시는 거죠?
And you're asking what question I asked, right? It was why the trial took place in Shimonoseki and what was the meaning for that? And what kind of implication did this trial have on the Japanese military comfort women movement? Why the trial took place in Shimonoseki? Normally, a trial is normally brought up against the defendant, where the defendant takes place. So it could be Korea, Japan. And so normally we could think that it would take place in Tokyo, where the capital is, because of the government. And at Shimonoseki, the WVLC and the comfort women were sent out to many locations, and they were transferred through Shimonoseki. So that was why it could be brought up at Shimonoseki. And the comfort women trial in many cases were normally filed in the Tokyo District Court. So normally the attorneys, if it is held at the trial at the court in Tokyo, in a sense, the judges at Tokyo court would be the top elite judges, the judges that went through a most elite educational course. And so the attorney assumed that for them it would be very difficult to rule against the Japanese government. So that was one purpose. And there would be the Yamaguchi prefecture and the Shimonoseki district. That's actually a very small court, a local court. And so if it is a smaller court than Tokyo court, then in this case, we assumed that maybe the attorneys would be less elite, so they could be more courageous and more strong-minded and make the ruling regardless of its impact on the government. So that was one of the purposes of filing the lawsuit at Shimonoseki. That was one background reason. And actually, we did meet a very courageous judge and who ruled in favor. And if the trial takes place in the Tokyo court, the plaintiffs had to travel a long way. But in the case of Shimonoseki, there was a Gwampu ferry, and the airline was also more affordable. So the transport issue was much more comfortable. And the Chinese attorney also thought that even though we don't win the case, the plaintiffs could always come to the court and raise an objection. In the case of a court, they're always surrounded by the media, and it was also the same. It was also the case for Shimonoseki. It was continuously covered by the media, but the attorney assumed that maybe we may not be able to win, but at least we could communicate that this issue should be recognized, and our support group. Ultimate goal is to revise and correct the legislation. That was our ultimate goal, and that was another purpose of choosing Shimonoseki as the site of trial. And in the case of the plaintiffs of the court, I understand that some traveled about 20 times. The victims came to the court and they tried to make a testimony. And this was covered by the TV or the newspaper. And through these activities, it has been promoted to a larger audience and the general public. And to add one more thing, the ruling judged that the legislation should be corrected, and this had a big impact on the lawmakers in Japan. So there were some committed lawmakers that tried very hard to work on bills to correct the legislation. And especially Fukuoka lawmakers made various statements at the Congress. Of course, the ultimate goal was not realized, but it did have a very significant impact on the legislative activities in Japan. And secondly, what was the second question? Could you please repeat the second question? The Gwampu trial was actually a first trial of Korean comfort women in Japan. So what is the historical meaning of the Gwampu trial? Why should we remember that? And how will it impact and have implication on following comfort women movements? As I've explained in my presentation, that was the only case that actually was ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. That had the greatest significance. And it also was a ruling to correct the legislation, which also led to legislative correction activities, which had a big impact. There were Fukuoka lawmakers that continued to take active measures at the Congress. And the opposing party, back then, when it became the ruling party, when the Democratic Party became the ruling party, they also tried to correct the legislation. But afterwards, the administration changed. So the ruling opposing party became the Democratic Party, which once became the administrative government. And they were very committed to correct the legislation. We were very expectant. But after that, the then Prime Minister Hatoyama took office and was strongly committed to resolve the comfort women issue. And he actually was preparing with us about the colonial rule and the invasion. He wanted to disclose all the atrocities and the damage and to resolve the issue. And this also included the comfort women issue. And one more thing is that at Okinawa, there were the movements opposing the removal of the bases and military bases, and it created a very sensitive reaction. And he promised to remove the military bases from Okinawa, but then he became defeated by the bureaucrats. To remove it, the US government and the Japanese government were required to consent. But of course, US would never agree. So Prime Minister Hatoyama back then, even though the promise was made, could not realize his promise. So Prime Minister Hatoyama, well, it was a very big commitment because he could not live up to his promise. He had to resign from the prime minister status. And afterwards, the legislation activity could not continue. If he had been in office for a longer time, the legislation could have been corrected on the comfort women issue. But there were political environments, and he was not that. Yes, so Ms. Hao Xiaoyang, you've waited a long time, so we're looking forward to your reply.
Okay, thank you. So if I understand correctly, you're asking two questions. The first one is about media coverage of the trials, and second about public reception of the same trials. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, that's great. So as far as I know, the trials didn't really receive like major media coverage. Like some of the court cases were reported in some local newspapers, but never really in detail. But this is not to say that the trials didn't exert any impact on Chinese society at all, because later, like years after the trial proceedings ended, there were actually exhibitions touring Chinese city, and those exhibitions were actually, the majority of the exhibitions were about the testimonies delivered by those comfort women during those legal proceedings in Japan. Well, I haven't really read much scholarship on this public response to the exhibitions, except for one. The scholar actually studied students' response to the exhibitions at the site of a university. So basically, she took a very close look at the messages left by students, and so some said that like they now realize the importance of peace, because during armed conflicts, women really bear the brunt of like sexual violence, and also some came to understand like victims didn't really only suffer from wartime Japanese sexual enslavement, but also post-war social prejudice and just discrimination from the local community. And also some came to critically reflect on the rise of Chinese nationalism as well. As for local complicity, I would say probably it is still a discursive impossibility in China. And the comfort woman issue, quite interesting, because when it first appeared in the public discourse, it was actually, as some scholars have pointed out, it was actually framed as a Japan-Korea diplomatic affair. And later, like with this rise of Sino-Japanese enmities, the comfort woman issue finally received major media attention. And it was in the 2010s that the comfort woman issue, finally entered into this historical awareness of the Chinese populace. But in the recent research I'm doing with my co-author, we actually noted that while the comfort woman issue entered into the historical consciousness of the Chinese populace, still victims themselves didn't really receive much attention. It was this screening of a documentary called 22. It's a documentary about Chinese comfort women victims. So since the screening of that film, finally, Chinese comfort women, the victims that came to the forefront of this whole issue. So yeah, that's all I have to say about it. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
시간 압박이 없습니다.
Well, if we had more time, it would have been very wonderful if we could go on. But I believe this is a very important turning point and starting point so that we can continue with this discussion with many participants from many countries. I'd like to thank all the keynote speakers for your wonderful and informative, insightful presentation, and also to all the audience. So we are slightly belated, so I'd like to apologize for the delay. And you held up the Gwanbu trial book. This is a newly published Gwanbu trial publication. I'm sure I understand that in Korea, baseless facts and baseless statements are penetrated. So we like to correct them. This book was published 2 years ago, and we understand there will be additional publications this year. And our publisher brought this book with us for your reference. And it will be exhibited here, so I'd like to ask for your attention. Thank you very much. Well, it was very impactful since you introduced it at the last moment. And now I'd like to leave the microphone. Thank you once again.